There are bones beneath the streets of London. Not the carefully catalogued remains of churches or old cemeteries. These are different. These are the bones of people buried in such numbers, in such haste, that the city simply built on top of them and moved on. Excavation crews still find them. A construction project in 2013 uncovered a burial pit containing at least 25 skeletons. DNA confirmed what the archaeologists already suspected. They had died of plague. 670 years later, the bones were still there, waiting underneath rush hour. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. The range of that estimate should tell you something about how impossible the event was to measure. A third of Europe at minimum. In some cities, more than half. In certain villages in southern France, everyone died. Every single person. And it did this in less than 4 years. Tonight, we go back to the world that existed before it arrived, and to the moment in the autumn of 1347, when 12 ships sailed into the harbor of Messina, Sicily, and nothing on earth was ever quite the same again. In 1347, Europe was crowded. After centuries of gradual growth, the continent held somewhere between 70 and 80 million people, its largest population in recorded history to that point. Cities had expanded past their old walls. Cathedrals were being built that would take generations to finish. Universities had filled with scholars arguing about Aristotle and theology and the movement of stars. The roads were busy. The sea lanes were active. Venetian and Genoese merchants moved goods across the Mediterranean with impressive regularity. Silk and spices from the east, grain and cloth from the west. This trade network, built across centuries, was one of the genuine achievements of medieval civilization. It was also the most efficient disease distribution system the world had ever produced. In the steppes of Central Asia, something had been moving west for years. Historians and epidemiologists now believe the plague originated somewhere near the shores of Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan, carried by fleas on the backs of rats that traveled in grain sacks and cargo holds, following the Silk Road westward. It passed through Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean coast, where a Mongol army besieging the city reportedly catapulted plague corpses over the walls. The survivors sailed for home. In October of 1347, 12 of their ships docked in the harbor of Messina. The harbor masters who went down to meet them found something they had no vocabulary for. The sailors were not well. Most of them were dead. The ones still alive were dying, covered in black swellings the size of eggs, clustered in their groins and armpits and necks, oozing blood and pus. Their skin had gone dark in patches. They were delirious with fever. They vomited blood. The harbor masters of Messina ordered the ships back out of port immediately. It was already too late. The ships were expelled. The rats stayed. A Franciscan friar named Michel de Piazza was in Messina when the ships arrived. He wrote one of the earliest surviving accounts of what followed. He described the swellings as hard as stones. He described people who went to bed feeling well and were dead before morning. He described how the disease spread through touch, through breath, through what seemed like nothing more than proximity to the already dying. The city understood almost immediately what was coming. Understanding it did nothing to slow it. It moved north through the autumn and winter. Catania, Palermo, Genoa, Venice. By January of 1348, it had reached mainland Italy in force. Pisa, Florence, Milan. Cities responded with the limited tools available. Prayers, processions, burning the possessions of the dead, barring travelers from infected regions. None of it worked. Not because the measures were foolish by the standards of their time, but because what they were fighting moved faster than any warning they could send. In Florence, a merchant and writer named Giovanni Boccaccio was watching. He was 35 years old, educated, with a talent for observation and the literary instinct to know that what he was seeing needed to be recorded. He wrote about the first signs, the swellings, the dark bruising appearing under the skin, the smell that accompanied the dying. He wrote about how people responded when they understood what was coming. Some fled the city. Some stayed and drank heavily, convinced that pleasure was the best insulation against death. Some barricaded themselves in their houses and admitted no one. Some devoted themselves to caring for the sick, most of whom died anyway, and many of the caregivers with them. He wrote that the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day was such that there was not enough consecrated ground to give them all burial. They dug trenches and laid the bodies in layers, like goods stowed in the hold of a ship. That sentence from a man standing inside a catastrophe, writing for whoever came after. The disease had 3 forms and only one gave you any real chance. Bubonic plague infected the lymphatic system and produced the swellings from which the disease took its name. The survival rate was perhaps 30 to 40%, depending on the individual and the sheer luck of exposure. It was agonizing. It took roughly a week to kill or spare. Pneumonic plague settled in the lungs. It was transmitted through breath, through the coughing and exhalation of the infected. If you were in the same room, you were at risk. The survival rate was close to 0. Killed in 2 or 3 days. A person could feel entirely well in the morning and be dead by the following evening. Septicemic plague moved through the blood and killed so quickly that people were found dead without any visible symptoms. Collapsing in fields, dying in their sleep, here 1 hour and simply gone the next. No one in 1348 understood any of this. What they had instead were theories. The Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris produced an official explanation at the request of the French king in October of 1348. Their analysis concluded that the plague had been caused by a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in March of 1345, which had corrupted the surrounding air. This corruption, mixing with human breath, entered the body and caused the disease. This was not superstition. This was the most sophisticated medical reasoning available at the time, drawing on Galenic frameworks that had been authoritative for 1,000 years. It was wrong. But it was wrong in an intelligible way, the best answer the available tools could produce. Other explanations were less careful. In the cities of the Rhine Valley, in Cologne, Mainz, Frankfurt, Strasbourg, rumors spread that the plague had been caused deliberately, that wells had been poisoned, that the poisoners were Jews. The rumors required no evidence. Fear at sufficient intensity produces its own certainty. In Strasbourg in February of 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a field outside the city. In dozens of other cities they were expelled or attacked or killed. Pope Clement VI issued formal statements clarifying that Jews were dying of the plague in exactly the same numbers as everyone else, which was true, and the attacks continued anyway. This is what catastrophe without explanation produces. Not inquiry, but accusation. Not understanding, but a name to put on the shapeless thing. Groups of flagellants moved through the countryside, marching in processions, publicly whipping themselves with leather straps studded with iron, believing that sufficient self-punishment might satisfy the divine wrath they assumed was behind the plague. The Pope eventually ordered them to stop. Some did, some didn't. The priests prayed and administered last rites and died at the same rate as their congregations. In one Benedictine monastery in southern France, a monk recorded that 23 brothers died in a single day. He had to stop recording because there was no one left to write about. The doctors did what they could. They bled patients to rebalance their humors. They applied heated poultices to the swellings to try to draw out the corruption. They burned aromatic herbs to counter the bad air they believed was carrying the disease. Some wore protective clothing, long robes, waxed coverings, gloves. The famous beaked plague mask, its long bill stuffed with herbs, came in the following century, after the plague had returned enough times that the profession had developed protocols. In 1348, the doctors improvised their way through a disaster they could not diagnose. Many of them died alongside the patients they could not save. The plague moved north through the summer of 1348, across the Alps and into the German territories, along the trade routes into France, west to the Atlantic coast and north to the Channel ports and across the water into England, arriving at Weymouth on the Dorset coast in June of 1348. By autumn it had reached London. By the end of 1349 it had swept into Scotland, Ireland, and Scandinavia. It did not stop at borders. It did not spare the young or the old, the faithful or the cynical. Seasons slowed it slightly. Winter reduced the flea population that carried the bubonic form, but nothing stopped it. By 1353, when the first great wave burned itself out, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people were dead. Florence had entered 1348 with a population of roughly 90,000. Within 18 months, 60 to 80,000 of them were gone. The city spent years afterwards simply trying to function with the people who remained. Property sat unclaimed because entire family lines had been extinguished. Fields went unplanted. Contracts went unfulfilled because one or both parties were no longer alive. The living moved through a city that still had the shape of its former self and almost none of its former population. The plague came back. This is the part that often goes unmentioned. The Black Death of 1347 to 1353 was not a single event but the opening of a wound that refused to close. The plague returned to England in 1361, in 1369, in the 1380s. It returned to mainland Europe on similar cycles for 3 centuries. Each wave killed fewer than the first. Survivors carried some immunity, and the most vulnerable had already died, but it kept returning, reshaping each generation's relationship with death before the next generation could fully recover. The world that emerged from the other side was different in ways that took generations to fully understand. Labor had become scarce. The peasant class in England could now, for the first time in centuries, demand better wages and better conditions. Landlords who needed workers could no longer simply command them, they had to negotiate. Some historians trace the beginning of the end of English feudalism to the summer of 1349, when suddenly there were more empty fields than there were hands to work them. The process took another century to complete, but the direction changed in that terrible year. The church had suffered damage that went deeper than the loss of priests. Priests died performing last rites. Nuns died caring for the sick. The devout died alongside the irreligious in the same proportions, by the same gruesome mechanism. If God was punishing someone, the precision was impossible to read. If God was present, the presence was indistinguishable from silence. This was not a question with a clean theological answer, and the struggle to find one left marks on European intellectual life that persisted for generations. Art changed. The great theme that emerged from the plague years was the dance of death, the danse macabre, in which a skeletal death leads representatives of every social rank in an endless procession. King, pope, merchant, peasant, child, all going together to the same end. The image appeared on church walls across Europe. A theological statement and a social one simultaneously. Death is the only true equalizer. No rank protects you. No wealth saves you. No prayer reliably intercedes. Memento mori. Remember that you will die. The phrase was not new. After the plague, it weighed differently. What the Black Death exposed, ultimately, was the distance between what people believed protected them and what actually did. The prayers did not stop it. The authorities could not explain it. The wisest doctors in the most prestigious universities constructed careful, internally consistent theories that were entirely wrong. The people who fled sometimes survived and sometimes brought it with them. The people who stayed sometimes died and sometimes did not. The distinctions between those who lived and those who died were, from any human vantage point, indistinguishable from chance. There is something in that randomness that medieval people found more disturbing than divine punishment would have been. Punishment implies an accounting, implies that the universe is watching, that what happens to you has some relationship to what you deserve. The plague did not punish. It visited. It arrived and moved on and left the survivors to make whatever sense they could of who was gone. The theologians and philosophers who came after struggled with this for generations. And out of that struggle, slowly, came a shift in how educated Europeans thought about the natural world. A growing sense that understanding what happened in the physical world required looking at the physical world, not only at ancient authorities who claimed to explain it. The plague did not cause the Renaissance, but it weakened the grip of explanatory frameworks that had been unquestionable, and left a space where new questions could begin to form. This is how catastrophe sometimes works, not by destroying everything, but by making visible the gaps in what everyone had agreed to believe. There is a churchyard in the village of Eyam in Derbyshire, England. In 1665, when the plague returned to England in what would be its last major visitation, a package of cloth arrived at Eyam from London, infected with fleas. The tailor who opened it was dead within a week. What followed was one of the more remarkable collective decisions in the historical record. The village voted to quarantine itself. They sealed the road. They sent word to surrounding towns to stop trading with them. They drew a boundary and agreed that no one would cross it outward, so that whatever was happening in Eam would stay in Eam. 260 people died, out of a village of roughly 350. The surrounding region was largely spared. Their names are on the gravestones in that churchyard. You can still read them. Margaret Blackwell, Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her husband and 6 of her 7 children in a single week and dug the graves herself because there was no one else left to do it. The rector William Mompesson, who organized the quarantine, whose wife Catherine died in August of 1666, whom he buried in the garden because the churchyard was already full. Ordinary people, inside an event so far beyond ordinary experience that no preparation was possible. They made decisions without information, without certainty, without any guarantee that what they were doing was right or that it would matter to anyone after them. Some of those decisions cost lives. Some saved them. Most were simply the decisions of people trying to protect something in the dark, with the tools they had, in the time they were given. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, still exists. It lives in the soil and in wild rodents across Central Asia and parts of the American Southwest and Africa. It still causes occasional human infections today. Modern antibiotics treat it effectively, which is why it no longer spreads the way it did, which is why the difference between the medieval world and our own is not human courage or intelligence or virtue, but a small pill discovered in the 20th century. The bones are still beneath the streets of London. They will find more of them. The plague pits were dug in a hurry, by people who were frightened and exhausted, and the city grew over them, and the city is still growing. Let that settle around you as the room goes quiet. Somewhere in the eastern steppes, the bacterium waits in the soil with the patience of something that has no concept of waiting. The cathedrals that stood half-built when the plague arrived were eventually finished by other hands. The fields that went unplanted were eventually worked again. The names of the dead, the millions of names of people who died too quickly to be recorded, who left no inscription and no document, whose entire lives reduced to a number in an estimate that spans a range of 100 million, those are gone. But the stones in Eam still carry names. And in the long patient dark of history, that is something. A name cut into stone. A record that someone was here and chose to stay and was seen and was known, and was mourned by someone who survived long enough to mark the ground. Margaret Blackwell, Elizabeth Hancock, Catherine Mompesson, let their names rest with you tonight.